There is a hunger inside you that you have never named. It moves beneath your skin like a second heartbeat. It whispers in the pause before you speak. It shapes the smile you offer to strangers and the silence you swallow when you disagree. This hunger is older than your memories, deeper than your thoughts, and more powerful than your conscious will. It is the desire to be liked, and beneath that desire, hidden in the shadows of your psyche, lives something you have spent your entire life running from. Tonight we descend into that shadow. We enter the mirror. We trace the architecture of a need so fundamental that it has shaped civilizations, toppled empires, and destroyed souls. But more than that, we discover what this hunger reveals about who you truly are, and who you might become if you finally had the courage to look. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture yourself in a room full of people. Feel the weight of their gazes. Notice how your body responds, the subtle tension in your shoulders, the carefully constructed expression on your face, the internal editor that screens every word before it leaves your mouth. You are performing, always performing, and somewhere deep inside, you know it. But here is the question that will guide our journey tonight. What are you so afraid they will see if you stop? The ancient Greeks had a word, eudaimonia, which is often translated as happiness or flourishing. But its deeper meaning speaks to living in accordance with your true nature, your authentic daimon or spirit. The philosophers believed that most human suffering came not from external circumstances, but from the violent contradiction between who we are and who we pretend to be. They understood something that modern psychology would not rediscover for 2,000 years, that the mask we wear to be liked is also the prison that prevents us from being free. Carl Jung called it the shadow, the dark twin that follows you through life, the rejected self that contains everything you've deemed unacceptable. And he made a radical observation. The things we most desperately want others to accept in us are often the very things we have refused to accept in ourselves. Your desire to be liked is not simply a social preference. It is a defense mechanism, a survival strategy, a fortress built from the rubble of 1,000 small abandonments, and behind its walls lives the frightened child who once learned that love is conditional, that acceptance must be earned through performance, that belonging requires the murder of authenticity. But what if I told you that this fortress is also a prison, that the very strategies you develop to protect yourself have become the bars that contain you, that the persona you constructed to be liked has grown so convincing that even you have forgotten the face beneath the mask? This is not a speech about becoming more likable. This is not a lesson in social strategy or personal branding. This is something far more dangerous and infinitely more essential. This is an archaeological expedition into the depths of your own psyche, a descent into the underworld of unacknowledged needs and disowned desires, a confrontation with the shadow that has been orchestrating your life from behind the curtain of consciousness. And I warn you now, once you see what lies beneath your desire to be liked, you cannot unsee it. Once you understand the shadow that drives this hunger, you cannot unknow it. This knowledge will change you. It will force you to make a choice between the comfortable prison of performance and the terrifying freedom of authenticity. So I ask you now, before we begin, are you ready to look? Are you ready to discover that the person you have been pretending to be is not who you are, and that the person you are is far more magnificent and terrible than you ever imagined? The mirror awaits, and it reflects not the face you show the world, but the face you have been hiding from yourself. Let us begin. Every mask has an origin story. Before there was the performance, there was a moment of rupture, a primal wound that taught you that being yourself was not enough. To understand your desire to be liked, we must travel back to the beginning, not just to your personal beginning, but to the evolutionary, developmental, and mythological origins of this hunger that shapes human consciousness itself. Picture a child, barely 3 years old, standing in a kitchen. The child has just knocked over a glass of milk. It shatters across the floor in a constellation of glass and white liquid. And in that moment, the child looks up and sees something in the parent's face: anger, disappointment, perhaps even rage. The child's nervous system registers a threat, not to the body, but to something more essential, to belonging itself. This is the primal terror that developmental psychologists call attachment anxiety. The infant brain, wired for survival, understands one fundamental truth: without the caregiver's love and protection, I die. And so, when love feels conditional, when acceptance seems tied to performance, the child makes a devastating calculation. Better to hide who I am than to risk being abandoned for being me. This is where the mask is born. The psychologist Donald Winnicott identified what he called the false self, a carefully constructed persona designed to meet the expectations of caregivers and society. The false self develops when the true self, spontaneous, authentic, wild, is met with rejection, punishment, or neglect. The child learns to suppress genuine feelings and desires in favor of acceptable ones, to replace authentic expression with strategic performance, to trade being for seeming. And once this pattern is established, it becomes the template for all future relationships. But this story is far older than individual psychology. It is written into the architecture of human evolution itself. Consider our ancestors on the African savanna 500,000 years ago. A lone human separated from the tribe was a dead human. Predators lurked in the tall grass. Resources were scarce. Survival depended absolutely on belonging to the group. And so natural selection favored those individuals whose brains were exquisitely sensitive to social cues, to signs of acceptance or rejection, approval or disapproval, inclusion or exile. Neuroscientists have discovered that social rejection activates the same brain regions as physical pain. The anterior cingulate cortex and the insula light up when we experience social exclusion, just as they do when we touch a hot stove. This is not metaphor. Your brain literally processes social rejection as a threat to your survival, because for most of human history it was. The desire to be liked is not a weakness or a flaw. It is an evolutionary inheritance, a survival mechanism encoded in your neural circuitry through millions of years of natural selection. Your ancestors, who cared deeply about being accepted by the tribe, survived to pass on their genes. Those who didn't care ended up alone in the wilderness, and their lineage ended with them. But here is where the story becomes complex, where evolution's gift becomes psychology's curse. The brain that evolved to keep you safe in a small tribal group of 50 to 150 people is now navigating a world of billions. The neural circuits designed to monitor whether the tribe accepts you are now monitoring whether strangers on the internet approve of your photos. The survival mechanism that once protected you from exile has become a tyrant that controls every aspect of your self-expression. You are running ancient software on modern hardware, and it is malfunctioning in spectacular ways. Carl Jung observed that the persona, the social mask we wear, is necessary for functioning in society. We need some degree of adaptation to social norms. The problem arises when we identify completely with the persona, when we mistake the mask for the face, when we forget that there is a self beneath the performance. And this forgetting is epidemic in modern culture. Think about the teenager who spends hours choosing an outfit, not based on what makes them feel good, but on what will elicit the most approval from peers. Consider the professional who modulates their entire personality in meetings, carefully calculating which opinions to express and which to conceal. Observe the social media user who crafts their online presence with the precision of a marketing campaign, curating every image and caption to maximize likes and comments. We have become performers in a theater where the audience never leaves and the reviews are instantaneous and public. And the applause has become more real to us than our own heartbeat. But there is a cost to this performance that most people never calculate. The psychiatrist Alexander Lowen spent decades studying what he called character armor, the muscular and psychological patterns we develop to defend against emotional pain. He noticed that people who chronically seek approval often develop a particular kind of rigidity. Their bodies become tense, held, controlled. Their breath becomes shallow. Their movements become calculated rather than spontaneous. They are literally armoring themselves against rejection. And over time, this armor becomes who they think they are. The ancient Stoics understood this danger. Marcus Aurelius wrote in his Meditations, "How much time he gains who does not look to see what his neighbor says or does or thinks, but only at what he does himself, to make it just and holy." He recognized that the constant monitoring of others' opinions was not just a distraction, it was a form of slavery. But why is this slavery so seductive? Why do we voluntarily surrender our freedom for the hope of being liked? The answer lies in a profound psychological mechanism that Freud identified and Jung expanded upon: projection. When you desperately want to be liked, what you are often seeking is permission to like yourself. The approval you crave from others is the approval you have withheld from yourself. You have split off parts of your own being, deemed them unacceptable, shameful, unlovable, and now you project the judge onto everyone around you. Every face becomes the face of the critical parent. Every interaction becomes a test you might fail. This is the shadow behind the desire to be liked. Not that you want others to accept you, but that you have not accepted yourself. And so you perform. You shapeshift. You become whoever you think others want you to be. And in the process, you lose contact with the only person whose opinion actually matters, the one looking back at you from the mirror. The philosopher Martin Heidegger called this das Man, the they self, the mode of being in which we allow the anonymous opinions of everyone to dictate our choices and identity. We fall into das Man when we ask not, "What do I truly value?" but "What will they think?" We surrender our authentic existence for the comfort of conformity. And the tragedy is that this strategy doesn't even work. Because no matter how perfectly you perform, no matter how completely you adapt yourself to others' expectations, there will always be someone who doesn't like you. There will always be rejection. There will always be the critic whose voice confirms your worst fears about yourself. The approval you seek is an oasis that retreats as you approach it, a mirage in the desert of the ego, and yet you keep walking toward it, don't you? Keep performing, adjusting, calculating, hoping that this time, if you just get it right, you will finally feel worthy, finally feel safe, finally feel enough. But there is another way. There is a path that does not lead through the approval of others, but through the acceptance of yourself. A journey that does not require you to abandon your social nature, but to reclaim your authentic one. A transformation that begins not with being more likable, but with being more real. And that path leads directly through the shadow. Jacques Lacan, the French psychoanalyst, described what he called the mirror stage, a moment in early childhood development when the infant first recognizes their reflection. But this recognition is deceptive. The child sees an image of wholeness, coordination, and mastery that does not match their actual fragmented, uncoordinated experience. And from this gap between the image and the reality, a fundamental alienation is born. The child begins to identify with the image rather than the experience, to prefer the reflection to the reality, to live for the mirror rather than for themselves. And this alienation never ends. It simply becomes more sophisticated. Your desire to be liked is a continuation of the mirror stage, an endless seeking of affirmation from external reflections because you cannot trust your internal experience. Every relationship becomes a mirror in which you search desperately for evidence of your worth. Every interaction becomes an opportunity to see yourself reflected as acceptable, valuable, lovable. But here is the cruel paradox. The more you need others to reflect your worth, the less authentic you become. And the less authentic you become, the more hollow the reflections feel. Even when people like you suspect they are responding to the mask, not the person beneath it. And so the hunger grows. This is the tyranny of the mirror, the feedback loop of inauthenticity that traps millions of people in a prison of performance. Let me tell you a story. There was once a woman named Sarah who built her entire life around being liked. She had mastered the art of agreeability. In conversations, she would mirror others' opinions, soften her own perspectives, laugh at jokes she didn't find funny. She dressed the way fashion magazines told her to dress. She pursued the career her parents wanted her to pursue. She dated the kind of men society said she should date, and everyone liked her. She was popular, successful, admired. On paper, her strategy was working, but there was a problem. At night, alone in her apartment, Sarah would feel a creeping emptiness that no amount of social validation could fill. She would look in the mirror and not recognize the person staring back. She would lie in bed next to partners who loved the version of her she presented and feel utterly alone. She had won the game of being liked, and the prize was exile from herself. The psychiatrist R.D. Laing called this condition ontological insecurity, a deep uncertainty about one's own existence and reality. When you have performed for so long, when you have adapted so completely to others' expectations, you begin to lose contact with your own core. You become what Sartre called a being for others rather than a being for itself. Your identity becomes entirely defined by external perceptions rather than internal experience, and this is where the shadow begins to assert itself. Jung was clear that whatever we deny in ourselves does not disappear. It goes underground, into the unconscious, where it gains power and autonomy. The shadow is not evil, it is simply everything we have decided is unacceptable. And the more we reject these parts of ourselves, the more violently they demand recognition. For Sarah, the shadow manifested as sudden, inexplicable episodes of rage. She would find herself screaming at her partner over minor irritations. She would experience waves of resentment toward the friends she always said yes to. She would have fantasies of burning down the life she had so carefully constructed. This was not a breakdown. This was a breakthrough, the shadow asserting the parts of her that had been silenced, the authentic self demanding to be heard. But the desire to be liked has a sophisticated defense system. It cannot tolerate such eruptions of authenticity, and so it employs a variety of psychological mechanisms to maintain the performance. The first mechanism is dissociation, the ability to split consciousness so that you can perform the role while distancing yourself from the performance. You become an actor watching yourself act, present but not present, there but not there. This creates the eerie sensation that many people report. I feel like I'm watching my life happen to someone else. The second mechanism is projection. Whatever you cannot accept in yourself, you project onto others. If you have disowned your anger to be liked, you will see everyone around you as unreasonably angry. If you have suppressed your sexuality to appear proper, you will perceive the world as dangerously sexual. The shadow you reject internally becomes the demon you fight externally. The third mechanism is what psychologists call reaction formation, expressing the opposite of what you actually feel. The person who smiles most brightly may be hiding the deepest sadness. The one who is always helpful may be seething with resentment. The nicest person in the room may be the angriest person in the room. These mechanisms are not character flaws. They are survival strategies developed in response to impossible situations. The child who learned that their anger resulted in abandonment had to find a way to be angry without being angry. The teenager who discovered that their sexuality was shameful had to find a way to be sexual without being sexual. But what works for the child becomes a catastrophe for the adult, because the adult has resources the child did not have. The adult can leave, can choose, can say no, can tolerate disapproval, can survive rejection. But the adult carrying the child's survival strategies does not know this. They are still operating from the primal logic of the wounded child: adapt or die. And so they keep adapting, keep performing, keep murdering the authentic self in service of being liked. Let me share another story, this one from the annals of psychology itself. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch conducted a series of experiments on conformity that revealed something disturbing about human nature. He would place a subject in a room with several confederates, people who were in on the experiment. Then he would show everyone a simple visual task, matching the length of lines. The correct answer was obvious, but the confederates would intentionally give the wrong answer, and in a significant percentage of trials, the subject would conform to the group's incorrect answer rather than trust their own perception. When interviewed afterward, some subjects said they genuinely came to doubt their own eyes. Others admitted they knew the group was wrong but didn't want to stand out or be judged. This is the power of the desire to be liked. It can override even the evidence of your own senses. Now extrapolate this experiment across an entire lifetime, across every interaction, every relationship, every moment where you had to choose between being authentic and being accepted. How many times did you give the wrong answer because everyone else was giving the wrong answer? How many times did you betray your own perception, your own values, your own truth, because the cost of standing apart felt too high? And here is where we must speak about the most insidious aspect of this pattern. The desire to be liked does not just shape your behavior, it shapes your consciousness itself. The neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga discovered what he called the interpreter function of the left brain hemisphere. This is the part of your mind that creates narratives to explain your behavior. But here is the disturbing part. The interpreter will construct a story even when it doesn't have accurate information. It will confabulate, make up reasons that seem plausible to explain actions that were actually driven by unconscious forces. When you have spent years modifying your behavior to gain approval, your interpreter creates a story to make sense of this. It tells you that you genuinely prefer what others prefer, that you actually believe what you say you believe, that the persona is the person. You don't just perform inauthenticity. You come to experience yourself as inauthentic is authentic. This is the deepest level of the tyranny, when the prison becomes so familiar that you mistake it for freedom, when the mask fits so perfectly that you forget you're wearing one. The existential psychologist Rollo May called this the loss of the sense of being, the terrifying experience of feeling unreal, hollow, a ghost haunting your own life. He observed that this was not a symptom of mental illness, but a consequence of living inauthentically. When you systematically deny your own experience in favor of others' expectations, you gradually lose contact with the core of your existence. And the tragedy deepens when we realize that this pattern replicates itself across generations. The parent who never learned to be authentic cannot teach their child authenticity. The parent who is controlled by the need for approval will unconsciously demand that the child be who the parent needs them to be. And so the cycle continues, each generation teaching the next that love is conditional, that belonging requires performance, that being yourself is dangerous. But there is something even more disturbing that we must confront. The desire to be liked is not just individual psychology, it has become the organizing principle of entire civilizations. Consider social media, that vast mirror in which billions of people seek daily validation. Every platform is designed around mechanisms of approval, likes, shares, comments, followers. The interface itself is an externalization of the psychological wound we have been exploring. It is a technology that monetizes the human need for acceptance and amplifies it to pathological proportions. Studies show that the same neural circuits activated by cocaine are activated by receiving social media notifications. The dopamine hit of approval, the anxiety of waiting for validation, the despair when the validation doesn't come. We have created a civilization-wide addiction to being liked, and the cost is catastrophic. Rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide among young people have skyrocketed in direct correlation with the rise of social media. Why? Because the tyranny of the mirror has become omnipresent. There is no escape. Every moment is potentially performative. Every experience is evaluated not for its inherent meaning, but for its potential to generate approval. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han calls this the achievement society, a culture in which individuals have internalized the demand for constant optimization and self-marketing. You are not just expected to be yourself. You are expected to be your own brand, your own product, constantly packaging and selling yourself for approval. And in this context, authenticity becomes almost impossible. Because authenticity is messy, it is contradictory, it contains light and shadow, strength and weakness, beauty and ugliness. The authentic self is not optimizable. It cannot be reduced to a highlight reel. It refuses to be contained by the narrow bandwidth of social acceptability. And so we edit, we curate, we filter. We present not our lives, but our life performances. Not our feelings, but our feeling performances. Not ourselves, but our self-performances. Until one day, we wake up and realize we have no idea who we are beneath the performances. This is the crisis point, the moment when the tyranny of the mirror becomes intolerable, when the emptiness of validation becomes more painful than the fear of rejection, when the prison of performance finally feels like what it is, a prison. And it is at this moment, this crisis point, that transformation becomes possible, because the shadow will not be denied forever. The authentic self will not remain silent forever. The truth of your being will not be suppressed forever. Eventually, one way or another, the shadow demands recognition. The question is whether you will meet it consciously, with courage and curiosity, or whether it will erupt unconsciously, with violence and destruction. Sarah's rage was not the problem, it was the solution. It was the shadow trying to wake her up, trying to tell her that something was terribly wrong, trying to force her to confront the lie she had been living. And once she began to listen, really listen, to what the rage was saying, everything changed. There is a moment in every authentic journey when you must die before you can be reborn. Not a physical death, but an ego death, the dissolution of the false self you have mistaken for your true self. The shamanic traditions call it the dismemberment. The alchemists call it the nigredo, the blackening. Jung called it the integration of the shadow, and it always feels like the end of the world. For Sarah, the awakening began with a simple but revolutionary act. She said no. It happened at a dinner party. A friend made a comment that Sarah found offensive, casually sexist in that way that usually goes unchallenged. And Sarah, who had spent 35 years agreeing, deflecting, keeping the peace, felt something shift inside her. The rage that had been erupting in private suddenly had words, calm words, clear words, true words. "I don't agree with that," she said. "Actually, I find that kind of thinking harmful." The table went quiet. Her friend looked shocked, then defensive, and Sarah felt her entire nervous system screaming at her to backtrack, to laugh it off, to smooth things over, to be liked. But she didn't. She held her ground, stayed with the truth of her experience. And something remarkable happened. Not everyone at the table agreed with her, but several people did. And one person later thanked her privately for speaking up, for saying what they had been thinking but were too afraid to express. This is the paradox of authenticity. When you stop trying to be liked by everyone, you finally become truly likable to the people who matter. But the transformation was not easy, because once you begin to speak your truth, you cannot go back to the comfortable lie. Once you acknowledge the shadow, you cannot pretend it isn't there. Sarah began the difficult work of shadow integration, the process of reclaiming the disowned parts of herself. She started therapy with a Jungian analyst who asked her uncomfortable questions. What are you angry about? What do you actually want? What have you been pretending not to know? She discovered rage, not the explosive, destructive rage that had been erupting, but the clean, clarifying rage that says, "This is not acceptable. I deserve better. I will not tolerate this." She discovered her sexuality, not the performative sexuality designed to attract approval, but her actual desires, her real turn-ons and turn-offs, the raw truth of her erotic nature that she had been suppressing since adolescence. She discovered her ambition, not the safe career her parents wanted, but the risky, creative path she had always dreamed of pursuing, the one that might fail, the one that required her to disappoint people, the one that was truly hers. And most terrifyingly, she discovered her voice, the authentic expression of her thoughts, feelings, and perspectives without the filtering and editing and calculating. The voice that said what it meant and meant what it said. Each discovery required a death, the death of the nice girl, the death of the agreeable woman, the death of the perfect daughter. And with each death came grief, mourning for the life she had wasted performing, for the relationships built on false foundations, for the years spent in exile from herself. But with each death also came liberation. Jung wrote that one does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. The shadow is not the enemy. It is the treasury of your vitality, your creativity, your power. Everything you deemed unacceptable and locked away is still alive in the shadow, waiting to be reclaimed. When Sarah embraced her anger, she discovered boundaries. When she embraced her sexuality, she discovered pleasure. When she embraced her ambition, she discovered purpose. When she embraced her voice, she discovered connection, real connection, not the superficial approval she had been seeking. Because here is what she learned. People don't actually want to be around perfect people. They want to be around real people. People who are flawed and struggling and honest about it. People who have integrated their shadows enough to be comfortable with complexity and contradiction. The mask creates distance. Authenticity creates intimacy. But let us go deeper into the mechanisms of this transformation, because shadow work is not simply a matter of being yourself. That is a platitude that trivializes a profound psychological process. Shadow integration requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into one side. You must be able to acknowledge your anger without becoming nothing but anger, to embrace your desire for approval without being controlled by it, to recognize your need for connection without abandoning your autonomy. This is not easy. The ego wants resolution. It wants to be either good or bad, liked or disliked, authentic or performative. It cannot tolerate ambiguity. But the self, the deeper, more complete totality of your being, contains all opposites. It is both light and shadow, strong and weak, loving and hateful. Shadow integration means expanding your identity to include what you have excluded. It means recognizing that you are not just the nice person who wants to be liked. You are also the angry person who wants to destroy, the selfish person who doesn't care what others think, the wild person who refuses to be tamed. And paradoxically, once you acknowledge these shadow aspects, they lose their compulsive power over you. The anger that erupted unconsciously in Sarah's relationships became conscious anger she could choose when and how to express. The resentment that poisoned her friendships became clear discernment about which relationships were nourishing and which were draining. The desperation for approval became a healthy desire for genuine connection. The shadow integrated is not the shadow eliminated, it is the shadow transformed. Neuroscience is beginning to understand the mechanisms of this transformation. When you bring unconscious patterns into conscious awareness through practices like therapy, meditation, or honest self-reflection, you literally rewire your brain. The prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain associated with conscious choice and self-regulation, develops stronger connections to the limbic system, the part associated with emotion and survival drives. In other words, you develop the neural infrastructure for freedom, the ability to observe your impulses without being controlled by them, to feel your emotions without being overwhelmed by them, to notice your desire for approval without automatically adapting yourself to gain it. This is what the Buddhists call mindfulness, what the Stoics called prosoche, what Jung called individuation, the development of consciousness itself. And as consciousness develops, something remarkable happens. You begin to realize that being liked is not actually what you wanted all along. What you wanted was to be seen, known, recognized for who you truly are. And that is impossible when you are wearing a mask. The approval you received for the performance was always hollow because it was not approval of you. It was approval of the character you played. But when you drop the mask, when you show up authentically with all your shadows integrated, something shifts in the quality of human connection. The people who reject you, well, they were never going to see you anyway. They were in love with the illusion you were maintaining, and you were exhausting yourself to maintain it. But the people who stay, the people who see the real you and choose to be in relationship with that, those connections have a depth and richness that performance-based relationships never achieve. Sarah discovered this when she ended several long-standing friendships that had been built on her compulsive agreeability. It was painful. Some people were angry, others were confused. A few accused her of changing, of no longer being the person they knew. And they were right. She had changed. She was no longer the person they knew because the person they knew never really existed. She was a performance maintained at great psychological cost. But as those relationships ended, new ones began, with people who were attracted to her authenticity rather than her agreeability, people who wanted real conversation rather than pleasant chat, people who could handle her complexity rather than requiring her simplicity. And she found something she had never experienced before. She could relax. She didn't have to monitor every word, calculate every response, perform every interaction. She could just be. And in that being, she was more alive than she had ever been while performing. This is the gift on the other side of shadow integration. Not perfection, not being liked by everyone, not the resolution of all conflict. The gift is freedom, the ability to show up as you are and trust that it is enough. But let me be honest about something that the self-help industry often conceals. This transformation will cost you. It will cost you relationships that cannot tolerate your authenticity. It will cost you opportunities that require you to be someone you're not. It will cost you the comfortable numbness of the mask, the familiar prison of performance. And in the beginning, it will be lonely. Because when you stop performing, you realize how much of your social life was based on performance. When you stop seeking approval, you realize how many of your connections were transactional. When you drop the mask, you see clearly which relationships were based on who you really are versus who you were pretending to be. This is the dark night of the soul that accompanies authentic transformation. And many people, when they reach this point, retreat back into the mask. They decide that the cost of freedom is too high, that the loneliness of authenticity is more painful than the prison of performance. But if you can stay with it, if you can tolerate the discomfort, the uncertainty, the grief, something miraculous happens. You begin to attract people who are also doing this work, other shadow integrators, other authenticity seekers, other individuals who have chosen freedom over approval, and together you create a different kind of community, one based not on performance but on presence, not on approval but on acceptance, not on being liked but on being real. This is what Jung called the collective unconscious seeking wholeness through individual transformation. When you do your shadow work, you don't just heal yourself, you contribute to the healing of the species. You break the intergenerational transmission of trauma. You model a different way of being human. And slowly, incrementally, you discover something astonishing. You start to like yourself, not in the narcissistic sense of ego inflation, but in the deep sense of self-acceptance. You recognize that the parts you spent a lifetime rejecting are not defects, they are dimensions, not flaws but features, not problems but powers, once they are integrated and expressed consciously. Sarah told me once, years into her transformation, I spent 35 years trying to get everyone to like me, and now at 40, I barely care if anyone likes me. But here's the strange thing, more people seem to like me now than ever before. Or maybe they always did, and I was just too desperate to notice. This is the ultimate paradox. When you stop needing to be liked, you become more genuinely likable, because people can feel authenticity. They can sense when someone has done the work of integrating their shadow. There's a groundedness, a presence, a realness that is magnetic, not to everyone. And that's the point. You're not trying to be liked by everyone anymore. You're trying to be true to yourself and trust that the right people will be drawn to that truth. And they will be. We have traveled far together tonight, from the primal wound of early attachment to the evolutionary inheritance of social anxiety, from the birth of the mask to the tyranny of the mirror, from the prison of performance to the freedom of authenticity, from the shadow rejected to the shadow integrated. And now we stand at the edge of a different kind of mirror, not the mirror that reflects only what you show the world, but the mirror that shows you who you truly are. This is the mirror of consciousness itself, the capacity to observe your own mind, to see the patterns that control you, to recognize the shadow that has been orchestrating your life from behind the curtain. And once you can see it, you can begin to transform it. The desire to be liked is not your enemy. It is a messenger. It is your psyche trying to tell you something important, that there is a part of you that has not been integrated, a wound that has not been healed, a need that has not been acknowledged. And that need is not actually the need for others' approval, it is the need for your own. Self-acceptance is not a destination you reach, it is a practice you cultivate. Every day you will face the choice between performing for approval and showing up authentically. Every day the shadow will present itself in some form. Anger you want to deny, desire you want to suppress, truth you want to conceal. And every day you get to choose, to meet the shadow with consciousness, to integrate what you have rejected, to expand your identity to include what you have excluded. This is the evolution of consciousness itself, not just personal transformation, but the transformation of what it means to be human. As more individuals do this work, as more people break free from the tyranny of the mirror, we collectively evolve toward a culture that values authenticity over performance, presence over image, being over seeming. We are living in a time of unprecedented psychological crisis, anxiety, depression, alienation at epidemic levels. But crisis in Chinese is written with two characters, danger and opportunity. The danger is collapse into further inauthenticity, deeper addiction to approval, more sophisticated prisons of performance. But the opportunity is a breakthrough to a new way of being, one in which humans can finally come home to themselves, one in which the need to be liked is transformed into the capacity to be real, one in which the shadow is not an enemy to defeat, but a treasure to reclaim. I want to leave you with an image. Imagine yourself standing before a mirror, but this is not the mirror of external validation. It is the mirror of self-recognition. And in this mirror, you see not just the mask you have been wearing, but the face beneath it. Not just the persona you have performed, but the person you truly are. And here is what you discover in that mirror. You are both more terrible and more magnificent than you imagined. You contain depths of anger and heights of love, shadows of selfishness and lights of generosity, impulses toward destruction and capacities for creation. You are not good or bad. You are whole, and wholeness, that is what you have been seeking all along. Not approval, not validation, not being liked, but being complete, being integrated, being real. The ancient alchemists had a phrase for this transformation: solve et coagula, dissolve and coagulate. First you must dissolve the false self, the persona, the mask. You must let it die. And in that dissolution, there is grief and terror and the feeling that you are losing everything. But then comes the coagulation, the crystallization of the authentic self, the person you actually are, with all your contradictions and complexities, your shadows and lights, your wounds and gifts. And that person, that real, whole, authentic person, does not need to be liked by everyone, because they have finally learned to be at home in themselves. This is the invitation tonight, not to become more likable, but to become more real, not to perfect your performance, but to drop it, not to hide your shadow, but to integrate it. And in that integration, you will discover what freedom actually feels like. It feels like exhaling after holding your breath for 30 years. It feels like coming home after a lifetime of exile. It feels like finally recognizing your own face in the mirror. The shadow behind your desire to be liked has been waiting for this moment, the moment when you turn toward it instead of away from it, when you meet it with curiosity instead of fear, when you recognize it as not your enemy, but your guide into wholeness. And once you make that turn, once you begin that integration, you join the great work of human consciousness evolution. You become not just an individual transforming, but a force for collective transformation. Because every person who breaks free from the prison of performance makes it easier for the next person to break free. Every individual who integrates their shadow weakens the collective shadow. Every authentic human being is a beacon for others who are still lost in the tyranny of the mirror. So tonight I ask you, who will you be tomorrow? Will you continue the performance? Will you keep chasing the mirage of approval? Will you remain in comfortable exile from yourself? Or will you take the risk? Will you drop the mask just a little? Will you speak one true word that you have been suppressing? Will you say no to one thing you have been saying yes to out of fear? Will you begin the journey home to yourself? The shadow is not waiting to destroy you. It is waiting to complete you. The mirror is not your enemy. It is your teacher. And the desire to be liked, once you understand it, once you see through it to the deeper need it conceals, becomes the doorway to a freedom you cannot yet imagine. Walk through that door. The whole real, authentic you is waiting on the other side. And that person, that magnificent, terrible, beautiful, broken, powerful, vulnerable, completely human person, that is who you were always meant to be. Welcome home.